Hey Optimancers, Treantmonk here. So we are into our 5th level spells in Treantmonk's Guide to Wizards, so welcome to the Wizard College, where we are going to discuss some of the better spells in the game as we head in towards the high level spells. As usual, I'll be using my normal rating guide, so red means I'm not recommending the spell. I think it's either too weak or not useful in enough circumstances to make it worth taking. If I rate it orange, that means I think it could be really good in the right circumstance. I just don't think that circumstance is going to come up often enough to recommend the spell. Then purple means I give it a modest recommendation. Green means I think it's a good spell and I'm recommending it for your character. But blue means it is a special spell, the kind of spell that I think really defines the wizards, and I am highly recommending it. I consider it almost a must-have for your character. As always, I'll be ranking the spells by spell school, from my most favorite to my least favorite with each school. So, let's get started. We're going to start out with the Abjuration School, and there's only one spell in the Abjuration School at this level, and that's Planar Binding. Now, Planar Binding, some people really love this spell. They think it breaks the game because theoretically you could bind many creatures with it. It will allow you to bind either a Fae or an Elemental or a Celestial or a Fiend, and you can control them for up to 24 hours. But there are a number of limitations on this spell, so let's kind of go over those. I think overall the spell's still okay, but I don't think it is game-breaking. The first thing is, it is a 1 hour casting time. That means that unless you have summoned the creature or have some kind of control over the creature, don't count on a creature sticking around an hour for you to be able to cast this spell. Now, there may be certain circumstances where you come across something that is trapped. Then you could potentially use this spell to bind that creature, but how often is that really coming up? When we're normally going to be using this spell is in conjunction with a couple other spells. The first is Magic Circle, which we can use to trap a summoned creature, and the second is a summoning spell. Now, if we, the wizard, are casting that spell, it's probably going to be either Conjure Elementals, or Infernal Summoning, or Summon Greater Demon. Though we could potentially also use this in conjunction with a Druid or a Cleric who is using Conjure Celestial or Summon Fae. But honestly, I think your best option with this is probably with the Conjure Elemental spell. So as I have said, unless we have actually just found a creature, we're probably using this in conjunction with a summoning spell. But it is important to note that this spell doesn't replace that summoning spell. What it does is it extends the duration of that summoning spell and keeps that creature under your control for the duration. So it is not going to bypass concentration. So you are going to be limited to one creature with this. The other thing to note, and this is going to vary from table to table, and it actually is the part of this spell that makes it hard to rank for me, is if a creature is hostile to you when you cast a spell on it, then it is going to try to subvert your commands. Now, what creatures are hostile to you is sometimes defined in the spell description, but a DM could reasonably assume that any creature that's going to be bound by you might become hostile to you. The elemental might not be hostile to you when you cast this spell, but once you cast it on it, it might become hostile because it doesn't like being planar bound. And then, just how far is your DM going to go with this subvert your commands thing? A lot of DMs might not do a lot with it. Others might be looking at every command you make and see if there's some way it could be misinterpreted. If that's the case, this could become more of a baggage than it is good. Also, this is a 1,000 gold piece casting, and that is consumed on the casting. So every time you cast a spell, you need to supply 1,000 gold pieces. Still, another creature, usually reasonably tough, for 24-hour duration is great for your action economy. And certainly there are some creatures even that are going to have spell-like abilities or useful racial abilities that can come up a lot in combat. And note that with scaling, we can get some really long durations with this spell. Though again, if we're increasing the duration of an existing conjuration spell, we're going to have to maintain concentration for that extended duration. So although we could potentially cast this the day before, have those spells recovered for the next day, we're still going to have to concentrate on this the entire day. Now, as a wizard, that is really a big resource cost because many of our best spells in the game are going to require concentration, and we can't really afford to give up the concentration on this, especially considering the resource cost and the time involved in getting it set up in the first place. Now, theoretically, there's no CR limit on this spell, which means if we were able to somehow come across something like Balor or Pit Fiend in adventuring, and somehow we're able to achieve the 1 hour casting time, and they failed a charisma saving throw because maybe we burned up their legendary resistances or something, potentially we could have an incredibly powerful creature bound to us for a very long duration, and that would not require concentration. So if every circumstance is right, it could be game breaking, but I just don't think you can count on those circumstances occurring. Now, when it comes to scaling, because we can increase the CR of the creature, usually with most summoning spells, you can upcast it and get a higher CR creature. It does scale okay. Also, if we use that higher spell slot, the duration can become really quite insane. And if we are a Conjurer, we can avoid those concentration saves from damage if we're 10th level or higher. So combine all those things together, I think this spell's okay. It scales reasonably well. And if we're a Conjurer, I'd probably look at it being green rather than purple. Speaking of Conjurers, let's get into our Conjuration spells. And my favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Conjure Elemental. Now, it is 1 minute casting time. So this isn't one of those summon spells where you can summon it in combat and put it where you need it. You're going to have to summon it beforehand, and then it has a 1 hour duration. Now, the reason I think this spell is reasonably good for a summon spell is there just happen to be some really nice creatures we can summon. Now, one thing to mention about Conjure Elemental is, technically speaking, you don't actually pick the creature. So what happens is you pick an area, so you pick air or you pick earth, and then the DM will pick an appropriate creature of the appropriate challenge rating for that area. So we kind of can control what we do. So let's say we are casting this as a 5th level spell. Then we can cast it on an area of air, and we're likely going to get an air elemental. I mean, a DM could technically choose a lower challenge rating elemental. I think most DMs wouldn't do that. They'd just give you an air elemental. You choose an area of water, you'd get a water elemental. In general, I am going to lean towards the air elemental here. It has great hit points, lots of resistances, lots of condition immunities, great maneuverability, and good attacks. So as a combat creature, we put all those things together, and it is the mix that I'm going to go for most of the time. But there are some exceptions to that. Things like earth elementals can get earth glide. Things like water elementals can do water vortexes. So there's certain circumstances where the individual abilities of those creatures might come into play. But there's 2 creatures that deserve special mention, I think. Now, if you casted it with a 6th level slot on an area of air, that's when you would get an Invisible Stalker. So we can summon an Invisible Stalker with this, that I think is offensively just not quite as strong as the Air Elemental, just because it does less damage with its attacks. But an Invisible Stalker is permanently invisible, and it can sense creatures from any distance. So it totally replaces the Locate Creature spell with a superior effect. And then in combat, it's still not bad because it is permanently invisible. It still has good hit points, still has good condition immunity, still has good resistances. So in combat, it's not as good as an air elemental, but I think it's still a reasonably good combatant. And that permanent invisibility and the ability to locate creatures wherever they are means that sometimes this is the better spell. Now, the other creature I hear talked about a lot is the Galebdur. So this is an earth elemental, and the big thing about it is that it can animate 2 boulders so that essentially become copies of it. So you can get to the point where you have 3 attacks around, and then you have this slam attack that can increase the damage even more. So technically speaking, the Galebdur can do more damage than an air elemental or any other kind of elemental. But there are some restrictions on here, and I think we need to go over them, because if you just take this thinking it's your best offensive option, you're going to be disappointed. The first thing is, there better be 2 boulders within range. If there aren't 2 boulders within range, the big ability it has of animating the boulders can't be used, and then it is just inferior offensively. The second thing is that animating those boulders is its concentration, and it is a +5 concentration save, which means even a DC 10 concentration save is far from a sure bet. So if that Galebdur is then targeted with attacks, it might lose those animations, and then it is going to be inferior to other elementals. The third thing is those animated boulders will have a duration of 1 minute. So even if it doesn't lose its concentration, this is a one combat kind of thing. So in the right circumstances, if we're worried about doing maximum offense for one combat, and there's boulders there, and we're not worried about being able to fly or anything, the Galeb Dur can be our best option. But another thing to remember about this one is, again, we're not actually choosing our creature, so if we choose an area of Earth, that doesn't mean we're going to get this creature. We might just get an Earth Elemental. In fact, I'd say as a DM, I'd be more inclined to just give the standard Earth Elemental. So we can't, again, just choose this creature. In general, I'm going to choose an area of Air, using a 5th level slot if I want the Air Elemental, using a 6th level slot if I want the Invisible Stalker. Now, when it comes to Conjure Elemental, losing concentration is bad. If you lose concentration, the elemental becomes hostile to you. I've seen this happen multiple times, and then you have to deal with the enemy and another enemy. So then this spell becomes far worse than having done nothing. I've seen elementals get lost in the first round of combat. So if you haven't really shored up your concentration save, this can be a problem. Now, if you are a conjurer, again, of 10th level or higher, you don't have to worry about that, because you can't lose your concentration from taking damage. So unless you're knocked unconscious, you're going to keep control of that elemental. And that's why, if you're a conjurer, I would call this a green spell rather than a purple one. My next favorite conjuration spell at this level is Steel Wind Strike. Now, Steel Wind Strike I don't think is right for every kind of wizard. The range on this is 30 feet. That means we're going to have to be getting in reasonably close, and we can pick up to 5 creatures. Then those 5 creatures, we can make an attack on each of them using our spell attack, and they would take 60-10 damage if we hit. Now, so this essentially becomes like a blast, but we're only picking our enemies, so we don't have to worry about friendly fire. 60-10 damage is okay damage for the level. It's not great, but because we can avoid all our allies with this, we can potentially do a reasonable amount of damage to a reasonable amount of enemies without worrying about friendly fire. The downside here is 30-foot range, and we have to be within that 30-foot range for those 5 different creatures. So we got to be pretty close to the combat. So if we're something like a Blade Singer, for example, that's mixing it up in melee regularly, this is a good choice. If we're something like maybe a Diviner who's maybe holding back and not getting into melee and kind of keeping the distance from the enemies, this isn't going to be quite as good for you. And because you actually end this spell next to an enemy, it could be really bad for you. So keep that in mind when you're deciding whether you're interested in this spell or not. This is a spell that's going to be a modest recommendation for me, but only for wizards that aren't afraid to mix it up. My next favorite conjuration spell at this level is Teleportation Circle. So Teleportation Circle is mainly an out-of-combat thing that's utility. It'll get you from one end of the world to the other end of the world with the casting of a spell. There is a small material component cost, not too bad. It is a 1-minute casting time, which means, again, we're not casting it in combat, it's only out of combat. And you can only teleport to locations where there is a teleportation circle that you know about. Now, this is kind of important because in the right campaign, that's still going to give you lots of options. Forgotten Realms, for example, there's teleportation circles all over the place. Do you know where they all are? You need to have seen them before and know their location. So this is going to be a little bit campaign dependent. If you are in a campaign where you are traveling large distances and you know about teleportation circles at those distances, this can be a useful utility spell. If there's not a lot of teleportation circles in the world you're in, or they're not going to the locations you need, then it's going to be pretty useless to you. So I'm going to call this a circumstantial spell, and it's going to depend a lot on your campaign. My next favorite conjuration spell at this level is Infernal Calling. So Infernal Calling is probably best compared to Conjure Elemental because they're kind of similar. They have the 1-minute casting time, the 1-hour duration. The difference here is that the creature you summon is automatically unfriendly to you, and then you have to do a charisma check against it to try to get it to follow your commands. Or you can potentially make a deal with it. So there's just all these caveats to this one that don't exist with Conjure Elemental. And if the devils were that much better than the elementals, that might be worth it, but they're not. So I don't see a good reason why I would take this over Conjure Elemental. And I'm only concentrating on one of them, so it's not like I can do both. Now, if you think there's a lot of devils that maybe have some interesting spell-like abilities or innate spell casting, in this CR range, there isn't. So just know that there's not a lot here beyond just regular fighting ability that we could achieve again with a Conjure Elemental spell. Now, if this is a spell that you want to use, then you want to be thinking about charisma check. So there are ways to boost your charisma check. There's ways to reduce its charisma check. Take a look at that, pre-plan, and you're going to find this more effective. My next favorite Conjuration spell at this level is Far Step, and I'm not recommending Far Step. I normally like teleportation spells, but Far Step I think is one of the worst teleportation spells for wizards. What it does is basically it is a concentration spell, and it's going to give you what is essentially a Misty Step every round. Now the range is better, but the big thing here is we're using our concentration. So if we're using our concentration on this, then we can't be concentrating on something else. And once we're not concentrating on something else, that really limits what we can do. So we're teleporting around, but what are we doing when we're teleporting around? Now that doesn't mean that teleportation can't be useful in itself, certainly from a utility standpoint or a maneuverability standpoint, but we have lots of teleportation options with wizards that aren't going to use our concentration. And some of them are much lower spell level than this. We can get Misty Step, we can get Dimension Door, and I think in a lot of cases those are going to be the better spells, even though they are lower spell level. So I just can't recommend this because I think it's going to be redundant with better spells at lower level. My least favorite Conjuration spell at this level, though, is Cloudkill. So Cloudkill is going to send alarm bells off right away because it is a poison damage effect that provides a Constitution saving throw. So those two things together should send all kinds of alarm signals out because lots of creatures are immune to poison and creatures tend to have good Constitution saves. But then we're going to add in that the damage here isn't that good. It's 5d8 damage and it is a concentration effect. Now, there is a chance you could get multiple rounds of damage with this, but we've just added enough bad stuff here that it's just not worth it. There are continuous damage effects that could also do multiple damage that is going to do more damage and better kinds of damage targeting weaker saving throws. The only reason you would even consider this spell is it has that rolling effect. It moves 10 feet per round. So if we were, say, clearing out a tunnel, or there's a town and we wanted to cause havoc in it, or a campsite and we wanted to clear out a bunch of enemies, we could potentially clear out a ton of enemies using this because of the rolling effect. That's about it. And those are really rare circumstances. And I just think almost always there's going to be a better choice here. So that brings us into our divination spells. And my favorite divination spell at this level is Rary's Telepathic Bond. So the first thing to note here is this is a ritual, which means we don't have to prepare it or use a spell slot. So it's already pretty good. 1 hour duration, and what it does is it creates telepathic communication between you and usually the entire party. We can also create telepathic communication with our familiar, for example. And then we can bypass that 100-foot limit normally that we have with our telepathic communication with our familiar, allowing it to scout much further than it normally would be able to do. Now keep in mind that you need to have an intelligence of 2 or higher for this spell, so there are some familiars that don't qualify, but a lot of them do. Certainly all the flying familiars do. Now, just having communication between your party that's telepathic is useful a lot of the time. Especially there's no limit on range here, so we could have this cast before a teleportation spell that's maybe going to separate the party. Generally, I don't like to split up the party, but there's situations where it happens. Being able to telepathically communicate is always useful. In social situations, being able to secretly communicate with each other is always useful. We can also use this as a replacement for the tongue spell because we can communicate telepathically with any creature with an intelligence of 2, regardless of whether you share a language. So it replaces the tongue spell, probably with a superior effect, all the other telepathic uses, and it's a ritual. So lots of good stuff here. A good spell, and I give it a solid recommendation. My next favorite divination spell at this level is Contact Other Plane. So with Contact Other Plane, you're going to contact some kind of extraplanar entity, and then you can ask it up to 5 questions, to which it answers yes, no, maybe, or unclear. Now, one problem here is if the DM determines that that entity doesn't know the answer, you will get unclear. And you may get a lot of unclears unless you know that the entity has specific knowledge that you need. And that is really limiting on this spell because if you are just hoping for an answer to a question you don't have, unless you know what entity will have that answer, you can't use this spell. The other thing to note is you're going to have to make an intelligence save when you make this. And it's not an easy intelligence save. It's DC 15. Now, we're going to have a good intelligence save, but probably not a guarantee. And if we fail, you're basically useless until you get a greater restoration or a long rest. So be careful about using this while adventuring. This is probably a better off time kind of thing. My next favorite divination spell at this level is Scrying. Now, in general, Scrying I consider to be just worse than divination spells like Arcane Eye, and it's a higher level. But there are some good things here. We can pick a creature, and then we can automatically spy on it. So we don't have to send an Arcane Eye to it. We just immediately scry wherever it happens to be. We also can not only see, but we can hear it as well. But it gets a saving throw, and if it makes that saving throw, this spell fails. So the uses here are going to be a little bit circumstantial. Now, if you are a diviner and you cast a spell, you can recover a 4th level spell slot. So the resource cost here is significantly less. And this is the kind of spell we might cast during an adventure if there is a creature that we know about that we want to spy on. We could also potentially use this on creatures that aren't our enemies. So somebody gets kidnapped, we could scry on them, we could see their surroundings, hear what's going on around them, and it might help us find them. My least favorite divination spell at this level is Legend Lore. So Legend Lore is basically going to give you like an enhanced history check or arcana check and give you a whole bunch more information about an object or a location. So to a large extent, we're enhancing a skill check here, and that makes it circumstantial on its own. The other thing I don't like about this is it's going to tend to give you cryptic language. And cryptic language often is one of those things that after the fact you look back and you realize, oh, that's what that meant. But it's not necessarily useful for you at the time. It really depends on how your DM plays this. But you could end up getting a lot of information that isn't going to be useful for you, or maybe you can't figure out. And either of those aren't really useful, and they're certainly not worth wasting a spell slot or a preparation slot. So getting into our enchantment spells, my favorite enchantment spell at this level is Synaptic Static. So this does the damage of a fireball, but it has a number of good effects here. First, it's psychic damage, which means far less likely to be resisted or immune. It is going to target intelligence, which is generally a weaker save than dexterity saves. And then creatures that fail their saving throw also are debuffed. So they're going to have a d6 penalty to any ability checks, any attack rolls, any concentration saves that they make for the duration of this spell. Now, they're going to get another saving throw every round, so they may be able to shrug this off later. But being able to combine blast plus debuff, and a reasonably good debuff, and this is something, because it's a d6 penalty, it would combine with something like disadvantage, so we could potentially stack it with other debuffs. So we're getting some damage, targeting a good save, doing a good energy type, and we're getting an additional debuff on top of it. So overall, I think it's a pretty good spell. My second favorite enchantment spell at this level is Modify Memory. Now, Modify Memory charms and incapacitates the target of the spell, but because they get advantage on saving throws if it's done in combat, it's not really a good combat spell because they're probably going to make their save, and if they make their save, nothing happens. But outside of combat, we can use this in social situations, and we can change the memories of creatures that are affected by this spell and they don't remember that you cast this spell. For a large degree, I think this is going to end up being a utility spell, but a pretty good utility spell. And while adventuring, we could potentially use it on things like prisoners and the like, and it could still be reasonably useful in those circumstances. So as a combat spell, it's really a no-go. But for out of combat, there's a number of utility uses here. So overall, I think it's a modest recommendation for me. My next favorite enchantment spell at this level is Hold Monster. Now, Hold Monster is the kind of spell that I tend to have a bias against, admittedly, because spells that target one enemy and they get a saving throw, and if they make that saving throw, nothing happens, I tend to not be a big fan of. And the reason is, you go into a combat, you use your action, you want to do something effective, and with these kinds of spells, what tends to happen is either you do something massively effective, or you do nothing at all. So it is an all or nothing scenario, and so it's far more of a gamble than I like to take. It reminds me of playing a fighter when you make your attack and you either hit or you miss. With wizards, I like the fact that I tend to hedge my bets. I target multiple enemies, and maybe they take partial effect if they make their saving throw. Or there's enough enemies that some are certainly going to fail their saving throw. Or I'm doing effects that don't provide a saving throw. So when I target one creature, and if it saves, nothing happens, that is not my style of play. But I will say that if you stick a Hold Monster, they have to fail their wisdom save, then they're paralyzed. And paralyzed is basically the end for them because attacks against them are going to be critical hits that can do so much damage, especially when we're combining it with things like smites or sneak attacks. Now they get a saving throw every round, which means that you better finish them off quick because they're probably going to break out of this spell in not too long. Now I will say, if you are an enchanter, you basically get a free twin spell effect on this once you reach level 10. So for me, if I'm playing an enchanter, this spell is far more attractive because now I've got 2 chances to stick this spell, which makes it twice as effective. And so for an enchanter, I would call this a solid green spell. But for everyone else, I think it is an okay spell. And it just isn't my particular style. But if you like those gambles, if you like the all or nothing scenario, or if you can combine it with something that you think is going to make their saving throw harder to make, then Hold Monster is a decent choice. My next favorite enchantment spell at this level is Geas. So this is a long duration charm spell. And what you do is you can supposedly influence a creature to do what you want it to do, and if it doesn't do it, then it'll take 5d10 psychic damage per day. So what this means is, if you want a creature to do something that's diametrically opposed to what it wants to do, it's going to just take 5d10 damage, heal it, and continue its day as normal. And it's not really going to do a whole lot for you. But there are campaigns where long duration charm spells, remember this isn't using your concentration, can be really useful. And then we can potentially influence people to do things that they might already be inclined to do, because we're going to get, with the charm condition, we're going to get the advantage on social checks, and then there's the punishment aspect if they don't do what we want them to do. So in the right campaign, if you're playing like a political campaign or something like that, or you're playing a campaign where you're trying to influence powerful people, then I could see Geas being really good. But for dungeon crawling and that kind of thing, it's not going to be useful to you. My least favorite enchantment spell at this level is Dominate Person. Dominate Person is going to use your concentration. They get a saving throw. If they make their saving throw, nothing happens. If they fail their saving throw, you can take control of them, but only if they're a humanoid. So we're super limited in who can be used on immediately, and that's a big problem with this spell. Once we take control of them, we can have them do what we want them to do, or we can use up our action to totally control them. We can even use their reactions. But this just has too many things I don't like about it. Single target. Saving throw, nothing happens. And it's limited to only humanoids. And that limited to only humanoids is the kicker for me. Now, if you are an enchanter, again, you can potentially target 2 humanoids with this, but you still have to be fighting humanoids. So if I'm preparing an enchantment spell, and I want it to be effective against multiple creatures in combat because I'm playing an enchanter, and I have a preparation slot to use, I'm always going to take Hold Monster before this one, but I would probably consider this a purple spell for an enchanter. So getting into our evocation spells, my favorite spell at 5th level is Wall of Force. Wall of Force is a combat ender, and it's not going to provide a saving throw. So what you do is you either create a wall of 10 by 10 sheets of force, or you're going to create a globe. And usually, when I use this, it's the globe. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a large creature, and I'm going to encase it in a wall of force. It ends up being a little bit like Autoluke's Resilient Sphere, except you remove the saving throw. So creatures with legendary resistances can't do anything about this. I've seen it used where we have maybe a couple dragons coming in, and they use Wall of Force, and one of the dragons is out of the combat. And it's really out of the combat. There's nothing it can do to get out of that Wall of Force. Now, if it's a spellcaster, there's potentially ways it could get out. It could disintegrate the effect, for example. But most creatures are going to have no way out of a Wall of Force. And then you encase the toughest creature, take out everything else, and then you can surround that toughest creature, and then you deal with it. So what Wall of Force does is there's lots of combats where it will just win the combat for you without a saving throw. It's just automatic. It has to be used tactically. Against single targets, it's not as good, right? Although you can adjust your maneuvering, that doesn't bring you the same advantage as the divide and conquer. But if we're facing one tough thing and then a bunch of not quite as tough things, this is really good. You encase the tough thing, deal with everything else, then you deal with that creature. Now it's using your concentration, so expect that you might become a target after casting this spell. So you might want to worry about defenses, things like the dodge action and that kind of thing. Use your Misty Steps to get out of dangerous situations, etc. Protect that concentration while you maintain that wall of force and let the rest of your party do their job. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Bigby's Hand. I love the versatility of this spell. Now, this spell isn't an automatic win the fight spell like a Wall of Force is, but there's lots of things we can do with this. As a bonus action, just some damage per round, we can use it for that. Not the best use of this, and not the best choice at this level for that kind of use. But 48 damage with your bonus action is okay if you've got nothing else to do. Main thing I like about this is being able to grapple creatures with it. We've used this for effect, again, against dragons. I've used this for effect, where a dragon that's maybe using flight and a breath weapon on us, we can grapple it, and now it can't move. We can avoid its breath weapon, maybe get in close, or attack it from range that it can't attack back. We can also use this for blocking and for cover. So just the versatility here is lovely with this spell. None of the effects are super powerful on their own, but being able to do it for multiple different things. It's using your concentration, but we can change the use of what we do with this on a round by round basis. No matter what you choose for this to do, it is using your bonus action. So we can also do something else with our action on our turn. So look for spells that maybe don't use concentration, and then we can combine them with this. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Wall of Stone. So Wall of Stone, I like wall spells in general, as long as they're real walls, and Wall of Stone is a real wall. I like Wall of Force better because Wall of Force is impenetrable, and we can completely encase creatures with it. Can't necessarily do that with Wall of Stone, but if we're using the spell as a straight wall in combat, so maybe there's lots of creatures and we're trying to divide and conquer them, a Wall of Stone can be better than Wall of Force because it covers twice the area. Now, it has a little less versatility. We can't float it in the air. It needs supports, but it has a decent number of hit points, so it's not easy to break through. So if you are fighting a bunch of creatures and you want to use a wall tactically to divide and conquer them, Wall of Stone is a pretty good choice. There's also utility use of Wall of Stone, and the utility use is that if you concentrate for the full minute, then the effect becomes permanent. So in off time, we could do things like create a wall around a keep and that kind of thing. We can also use it to create a bridge over a chasm. So there's a number of utility uses there, mainly though as a combat spell and as a wall spell. I think it's a good spell. The only reason I don't recommend it with blue is because we have Wall of Force, and Wall of Force is probably the better spell most of the time. But there are occasions, even in combat, where I think Wall of Stone is the better option, and it's a good option. Now, there's redundancy. I wouldn't take both. I'd pick one or the other, and most of the time I'm going to take Wall of Force. But I think if you choose to take Wall of Stone instead of Wall of Force, I think you'll still be reasonably well served by it. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Cone of Cold. So Cone of Cold does 8d8 cold damage, which is decent damage for the level. Now, it has a huge area, a 60-foot cone. That's a lot of squares it covers. But cones are hard to place. That's why I only give this purple. Hitting a lot of enemies with a cone without hitting any allies is tough to do. And it is very set in its shape. So it can be difficult to place this spell effectively where we're hitting a lot of enemies and not allies. If we can, the damage is okay. Now, an Evoker can use this much better than anyone else can because Sculpt Spells is going to be really useful to you here. Also, we're going to get a bit of a boost to damage with Empowered Evocation. And when we get to 14th level and we get Overchannel, this is a good candidate because we're talking about 64 base damage here before we even add our Empowered Evocation. Combine that with Sculpt Spells, this is a solid blast spell for an Evoker. For everybody else, as a blast spell, I think it can be a little hard to use. It can be okay. And the damage is reasonable, and the effect is very big. So it's really just about finding the right way to position it so that we can get a lot of enemies without getting our allies. And that can be tough. I don't like any of the other evocation spells at this level, but I guess my next favorite is Dawn. So Dawn is a blast spell as well. It doesn't do good damage. It is a continuous effect. It's going to use your concentration, and the enemy must end their turn in the effect to take the damage. They're likely not going to do that. If you want to see a spell that's a little bit like Dawn, that's just way better, look at Moonbeam. Moonbeam cast by a druid using a 5th level slot is just so much better than Dawn. It should make it really obvious that this is a spell you want to avoid. Now, the only reason why you would take Dawn, and the only reason why I'm ranking it as my next favorite spell at this level, is at least it counts as real sunlight. So if we are fighting a creature that has a problem with sunlight, then Dawn can be useful for that. But in general, against the vast majority of enemies in the game, I don't think Dawn is a good blast spell at all. My second least favorite evocation spell at this level is Wall of Light. So Wall of Light, again, is a blast spell, and it's a bad blast spell. It does terrible damage. It's not really a wall. It does block vision, but we have so many things that can block vision up to this point. It can potentially cause blindness for a round, and then they get another saving throw. But this is a Constitution saving throw. We could cause permanent blindness with a 2nd level spell, by the way. And then for continuous damage. This is terrible. You have to use your action to do crappy damage to a single creature. So the Wall of Light has all kinds of bad, stacked upon bad. Hits the wrong saving throw, does terrible damage, doesn't have powerful effects. So I think all in all, this is a pretty garbage spell. But it's not the worst spell for evocation at this level. The worst spell for evocation at this level, and I think the worst spell at this level, is Immolation. Immolation is a spell that does the same damage as a fireball, except it only does it to one creature, and it's using a 5th level slot. Now, we are also going to get to use our concentration on this spell, and if we concentrate on following rounds, it might take some really crappy damage. And that's it. That's what Immolation does. We are so much better off just casting a 3rd level fireball 90% of the time. We have effects that do good damage to single targets. So having a spell that only does damage to single targets, and that damage isn't good, makes this spell just terrible, and you really should avoid it no matter what subclass you are. So let's get into our illusion spells. My favorite illusion spell at this level is Mislead. So what Mislead does is it's an invisibility spell, but it also creates an illusionary double of you. But it's more than just an illusionary double because you can see and hear through its eyes and through its ears. So what you could do is you could cast this as an hour-long duration and then send your illusionary duplicate through the dungeon. And then, unlike an arcane eye, it can also hear what's going on. Now, because it's an illusion, it can be perceived. So there are some obvious, pretty significant downsides here because it can be seen by enemies and then they might know that you're spying on them. Now, you're invisible, but your allies presumably are not. Also, as a combat spell, this isn't overly useful because it's not an improved invisibility effect. So you can create this and maybe your illusionary duplicate is going to get some enemy targeting, and that's about as much as you can expect from it. Then if you want to do anything else, you're probably going to have to break this spell and its concentration as well, so it's pretty limited in what else you can do anyways. This is mainly going to end up being a utility spell for you, and as a utility spell, I think it is a reasonable spell. My next favorite illusion spell at this level is Seeming. So Seeming, what it does is 8-hour duration spell. 8-hour duration is good, and you can basically do a disguise self on a mass scale. And this can be useful in certain campaigns if we're trying to infiltrate. We could even have a situation where maybe we're being attacked by the town guards and their reinforcements arrive and we cast this and now we're the town guards and they're us. And we might get them to attack our enemies instead of us. But I do think that the uses of this are going to be circumstantial enough that I can't justify more than an orange rating. Also, I should point out that an illusionist is going to get some use here because an 8-hour duration is pretty long and they can use malleable illusions to change that illusion. So for them, I think, again, it's still orange because it's still really circumstantial, but I think it's even better for them in those right circumstances than it is for anybody else. My next favorite illusion spell at this level is Dream. I don't think Dream is an overly useful spell. We can use it on things like enemy spellcasters if we know about them to remove their ability to take proper rests. We could also use this potentially as a long-range communication, and that might be okay because, unlike sending, we could actually sit down and have an actual conversation with somebody, but there's limitations too. They have to be sleeping when we cast this, and do we necessarily know when that is? So Dream has all kinds of limitations. I think if you want long-range communication, I think sending is the better spell. If we want to affect enemy spellcasters, how often does that even happen? Where we know the enemy spellcaster, they've used their spells, we want to prevent them from resting. In a lot of campaigns, this is never going to come up, so I can't even justify really an orange ranking here. My least favorite illusion spell at this level is Creation. So what Creation does is it actually creates an object for you. But the object is a limited duration object. So I guess the idea here is it's kind of a utility thing. So I needed a rope bridge. Well, I can create a rope bridge, and it could last for up to a day, and I get to use a 5th level spell slot to make it. And those kind of things just don't come up enough, and they're not effective enough to justify the spell level here. Creation shouldn't be a 5th level spell. It should be maybe a 3rd level spell, maybe even a 2nd level spell. As a 5th level spell, I don't think it really holds up. Now, technically, we could make an adamantium object. It only lasts a minute, but if there was a creature, it could be affected by adamantium. We had no other way to affect it. We could create an adamantium weapon and attack it for 1 combat, but there's not a lot of creatures that are affected by adamantium that aren't affected by magic weapons. And we could create magic weapons levels and levels ago. So again, I just am not seeing why Creation is a 5th level spell. It's the kind of spell that I generally like because it is going to reward creative use, but the spell level here is prohibitive. So let's get into our necromancy spells. And there's actually a half-decent necromancy spell. It's Danse Macabre. And this spell creates 5 skeletons or zombies for you. You need to use your bonus action to command them, but you can give them general commands. So you could say, attack these enemies, and they would continue to attack round by round until you give them some other kind of command using your bonus action. Where I think Danse Macabre is really good is if you are a necromancer, because although undead thralls technically won't get the extra skeleton or zombie, that only works if you're using an animate dead spell, it will give them the bonuses, which is your intelligence bonus to both their attack and damage rolls. So if we take the bonuses we get with Danse Macabre and then we add them to the undead thralls bonuses from necromancers, this becomes a really good spell for a necromancer, because you could take something like 5 skeletons with bows, and then they're getting the bonus from your proficiency bonus and the bonus from your intelligence bonus. That means that these skeletons are going to be looking at probably a +8 to hit and about maybe 13 or 14 points of damage on each hit, 5 attacks around. So that's reasonably good damage for this level. And then we're going to increase their hit points from 13 to 22 if we're a necromancer casting this as a 9th level caster. And that makes them a little less fragile. But I think I should point out that regardless, whether we are using that or not, these creatures are not overly durable. And so an enemy who can do mass damage is going to wipe them out reasonably easily. So this isn't good in all combats, but I think for most casters, this is a purple rating. I give it a modest recommendation. If you are a necromancer, it's blue. You should take this spell for sure. Not a big fan of the last 2 necromancy spells. The first one is Negative Energy Flood. Does 5d12 damage to 1 creature. If it fails a con save, half of it does. So we're targeting a bad saving throw for what is pretty moderate damage, single target. And then if the creature dies from this, then it becomes a zombie. That is not under your control. So creating a zombie with a 5th level spell is nothing. And the damage here isn't good. We're hitting the wrong saving throw and it's only affecting 1 target. But the worst spell at this level for necromancy is Enervation. And Enervation really gives Immolation a run for its money. Enervation does 48 points of damage per round using your concentration. And you have to use your action every round to do another 4d8 damage. That is terrible damage using your action and your concentration. Now you do get half the damage in self-healing, so there are maybe some circumstances where this is good. Maybe after a fight again to do damage to an enemy and get that healing yourself. Kind of like Vampiric Touch, but kind of like Vampiric Touch. I just don't think the damage is what it needs to be. This is, as an out-of-combat healing spell, this is a 5th level spell. We can heal the entire party using a 2nd level spell. And then in combat, the damage is just so bad. This is not worth using your action for every round. So going from bad damage, let's go to great damage. So we're going to go into our transmutation spells, and the best transmutation spell, in my opinion, at this level, far and away, is Animate Objects. So Animate Objects allows you to pick up to 10 objects, depending on their size, and then you animate them. And if they have no obvious way to move around on the ground, so they don't have legs or anything like that, then they fly. So the idea is you take 10, silver pieces, and then you animate them, and then they attack your enemies. Each one, +8 to hit, 1d4 +4 damage. So against a single target, this can do an amazing amount of damage. If we spread out those attacks, it's not great damage. Then we're better off using an area of effect. But against a single target, we can concentrate a massive amount of damage here. And we can use this with our bonus action each round. So how much damage does it do? Well, using your bonus action every round, you can expect at 9th level to be doing around 35.5 points of damage to an enemy. Now, if you remember my calculating average damage video, which I am going to post up above, we had a baseline where I considered to be reasonable damage for the level, and at 9th level, the reasonable damage for that level was just under 18 points of damage. So we're doing double the damage, 100% increase over the baseline, and we're not even using our action. This is just using our bonus action every round. Now again, like with Bigby's hand, what I recommend is if you take this spell, when we're selecting our other spells, start looking for spells that don't use concentration, because then you can do them while you're using your animate objects. Now, there are some other good options here. You could just dodge, right? Animate Objects is using your concentration. It's going to be doing a lot of damage, so it might be making you a target. So using a dodge action is a reasonable option here. If we want to boost the damage a bit, we could just throw a cantrip on top. It's not going to increase the damage by as much as you might think, though. We're talking about maybe from 35 to around 45 points. So that's not a game-changing damage boost. But if you have nothing else to do with your action, why not? Another 10 points of damage is another 10 points of damage. One way or the other, Animate Objects is a lot of damage to be doing to one creature in a combat. Now, I mentioned silver pieces because some creatures have resistance to bludgeoning damage, but not if the weapon is silvered. That's going to be things like lycanthropes and devils. We might also want to have maybe some sling stones that are adamantium, so that we can affect creatures that are normally resistant to non-adamantium attacks. But there are going to be some creatures, actually a reasonable amount of creatures, that are going to have resistance no matter what we do, because they're going to have resistance to all bludgeoning attacks that are non-magical, and we can't animate magical objects. So against those, half this damage. So then what are we doing? Well, we're doing about the baseline damage. About the baseline damage, using our bonus action and a concentration, is okay. So Animate Objects doesn't become a bad spell just because the creature has resistance, but it does become far less dramatically good. So let's move on to my next favorite transmutation spell at this level, and that is Telekinesis. Now, Telekinesis and Bigby's hand have some redundancy, so I'm probably not selecting both. I'm going to pick one or the other, because the main thing we can do with Telekinesis is we can pick a huge or smaller creature, and we can restrain it with our Telekinesis, and then we can float it up in the air and just hold it there restrained. And the chance to do that is a little bit less than we would have for grappling with Bigby's hand, but on the other hand, it is restrained, which we aren't getting with the Bigby's hand. Now, there are less things we can do with this. Bigby's hand has all kinds of other things we can do with it, and this is using our action on our round. But one thing we can do with it is, of course, just telekinesis an object, and there's obvious utility uses for this, but it's also been mentioned to me that if you needed a floating platform to fight off of, you could telekinesis an object and fly the entire party around. So overall, this is a good spell. Like Bigby's hand, a good spell, does similar things. Bigby's hand has a little bit more in terms of creating cover. It also has a little bit more in terms of doing damage. Telekinesis has a little bit more in the condition it applies to the enemy that it makes its check against. And also keep in mind that the enemy is resisting this with a strength check, and we can influence that strength check with a number of different ways. One of the most obvious is just throw a hex spell on it, but there are other ways. There are conditions that can give it disadvantage on that check. So we want to think about those things when we're using a telekinesis spell to make it more reliable. My next favorite spell at this level is Transmute Rock. Now, one of the reasons that I really like Transmute Rock is it's not concentration. So we've already talked about a number of spells at this level, like Animate Objects, like Bigby's Hand, that are going to be using up bonus actions on our round and are going to be using a concentration. So we're looking for spells that don't use concentration that can still do effective things. And Transmute Rock is absolutely one of them. One of the things it can do, and probably the main thing I would do with it, is you cast it underneath an enemy's feet. They fall into it, then they make a strength saving throw. If they fail that strength saving throw, they are restrained. Also, moving through it is really slow. It's 1/4 your movement. Keep in mind, let's say we have Animate Objects up. So then we cast this spell. Now we've restrained enemies. now we can use our animate objects, and they're all going to attack with advantage, and we're going to significantly increase that already great damage. Things like that. And Transmute Rock has some versatility. We can cast it on the ceiling, and it falls and does some damage. We can cast it on the mud to turn it back into rock and potentially trap creatures. So there's a number of different things we can do with it. None of them are super, super powerful on their own, but it doesn't use concentration. That's a big deal. So we're doing mass effect, no concentration. That makes this pretty rare. And we've got some versatility on top of that. So overall, I think this is a very good spell. My next favorite transmutation spell at this level is Passwall. And one of the problems I have with Passwall is we actually have a similar effect at a lower level, and that is Shape Stone, because we can use Shape Stone. I talked about that in that video, to create a hole in a wall so we can pass through it. So we can potentially use that spell using a lower level spell slot to perform the same effect as a Passwall is going to do for us. But there are some advantages to the Passwall. The Passwall is going to go deeper, it's going to last longer, and it can be used on non-stone walls, or ceilings or floors. So there are a number of ways that Passwall can be used that Stone Shape can't, but there is some redundancy here. And Passwall isn't something we're going to need all the time. We're going to need it once in a while when we're trapped and we need to escape, or maybe we're trying to bypass a challenge. Then Passwall can be effective. So it's circumstantially effective, thus the orange rating. Now we're into the spells for transmutation that I'm not a fan of. The first is Control Winds. So let's acknowledge first off, Control Winds has a great range. It covers a massive area. But the problem is that it has a number of effects, but none of those effects are dramatic. We can do things like create disadvantage on ranged attacks, which we could do so many ways with so many lower level effects. We can reduce falling damage, we can make it harder to move, but again, these are all relatively minor, and this is a 5th level spell, and as a 5th level spell we're expecting dramatic effects, and there's nothing here that's dramatic. So great range, yes. Great area, yes. There are circumstances where maybe we're fighting an army of archers, and Control Winds would be pretty useful to give them all disadvantage. But those circumstances are rare enough I can't even really justify an orange rating. And my least favorite transmutation spell at this level, even though I don't think it's useless, is Skill Empowerment. So Skill Empowerment gives you expertise in one skill, if you don't have it already. So if you already are proficient in the skill, it'll basically give you your proficiency again. And if you're not proficient in this skill, you're going to get double your skill proficiency as a bonus to the checks. It does combine with Enhance Ability, so potentially 2 different casters could both buff the same target to give them a super advantage on a check. But Enhance Ability overall I think is just as good. You're getting advantage on all those checks as opposed to expertise, which in most cases is going to pretty much balance out. But Enhance Ability is a 2nd level spell. Now wizards can't get it, so maybe a wizard who is just looking for a way to buff themselves or an ally in a skill check can use Skill Empowerment because they can't get Enhance Ability. But given that I find that the effects of the two are relatively comparable, and one's 2nd level and one's 5th level, it makes it very hard for me to recommend the 5th level slot. So that's it. Those are the 5th level spells. What do you think of those 5th level spells? Tell me in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to relax and I'm going to have some fun because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers, and I will see you next week.